Welcome to See You on the Other Side, where the world of the mysterious collides with the world of entertainment. A discussion of art, music, movies, spirituality, the weird, and self-discovery. And now, your hosts, musicians and entertainers who have their own weakness for the weird, Mike and Wendy from the band Sunspot.
Episode 260, Crossroads, The Devil and Robert Johnson. August 16th was the 81st anniversary of the passing of the legendary blues musician Robert Johnson, so we wanted to talk about some of the legends of this guy for this week. Wendy and Scott, how are we doing today?
Well, better than Robert Johnson, who has spent the last 81 years apparently in hell.
Right.
As the legend goes.
As the legend goes.
Doing great over here, though.
Yes.
Really excited about this week.
Why is that, Wendy?
Well, because we have a big road trip coming up, Mike.
Ah, yes, we do, to the beautiful shores of Sault Ste. Marie.
Yes, I can't wait to play at Michigan Paracon.
So we'll see you guys there. We'll be playing on the Saturday night of the Michigan Paracon, Sault Ste. Marie. There are still tickets available, but I think they're running out. So you're going to want to make sure you have to buy them at the door. And Wendy and I will be performing there Saturday night. You have a chance to meet some paranormal TV celebs, if that's your thing. And then a ton of people who've been on the podcast before as well. The Ghost Brothers will be there. Greg Lawson will be there.
Oh, man.
Yeah, a lot of people that we met for the first time at Michigan. It's always one of the big highlights of the year for us.
Yeah, this will be, our third time going?
Yes, it will be. And Ursula from Chicago Hauntings will be presenting. So we talked with her before. And it's going to be a lot of fun. Oh, the Ghost Hunters are going to be there. So if you're getting excited about the new season of Ghost Hunters, like I know y'all are, Kristen Luman, who's been on the show before, she'll be. It is a murderer's row.
Yeah, and it's in beautiful Sault Ste. Marie, which is right on the border between the United States and Canada, so we can gaze wistfully over the over the locks.
Yeah, pop over the border to grab some maple syrup and weed.
Yeah, exactly. And Tony Hortons, right? That's the donut.
Bob
Donut
Hortons.
place
Or Tim
everybody-
Hortons. What am I saying?
Tim
Bob.
Hortons.
There we go.
I'm thinking of
we're
Bob
so
Evans.
American.
I always conflate those places because they're not in Wisconsin. Bob Evans and Tim Hortons.
And I'm thinking Tony Horton, like the P90X guy.
Yeah.
He doesn't like donuts. Donuts bad.
Right. Tony.
Make you all mushy.
Right. If you want to be a slab of lard instead of a slab of fine beef like Tony Horton, you're going to have some of those Canadian maple syrup donuts.
Right.
Anyway.
But if you're going to be there, please make sure and say hello to us. And you can come and see us perform some paranormally inspired songs on Saturday night.
That's
What
right.
time is that, Mike, that we're playing?
We'll be playing from 6 to 9. 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. So
Wow.
we got a lot of music for you, and it's going to be a lot of fun. And Michigan Paracon is always a delight. And anyway, we'll party with you guys there. So we just wanted to get that message out there right away. If you guys are coming to Michigan Paracon, come and meet us. Let's hang out. Let's have some beers in the bar, have some music out front, and just talk about weird stuff.
And if you're not going, but there's something that you want us to check out for you, we
yes.
can do some reporting. So just let us know if there's anything particular that you want us to talk about or check out.
I got to say, one of my highlights last year was watching Jeff Blanger, who was one of your guests, watch you guys perform Digging Up the Dead, a song based on his episode. Watch that live. He was just beaming watching you guys play it.
Oh, that's
That was
nice.
a very cool moment.
Like a proud
That's
father.
cool.
Yeah.
Right.
So, no, that'll be fun. Oh, yeah, Jeff Blanger, he's always a delightful storyteller. Anyway, the place is chock full of awesome storytellers, and we can't wait to party with you guys in Michigan. We're going to invade the UP, take it back for Wisconsin, and have a good time coming up this weekend at Michigan Paracon. We'll have links in the show notes and talk more about that. But today, we are, I wouldn't say celebrating the anniversary of someone's death. That sounds
about-
morbid.
Yeah.
Commemorating.
And why would something morbid happen on this show? You know?
I guess
Nice.
you're right. Morbid's kind of what we do.
But commemorating works, yes.
Yeah. It's sometimes when I think about the songs we sing and, the stuff based on the podcast and the different themes of our music, I think about this review we got from a Cincinnati magazine maybe 10 years ago, or whatever. And it was like, they're the happiest songs about the most disturbing topics you can imagine. And it just made me laugh. I was like, yeah, I guess you're right. But other people write great love songs. Somebody has to write a song about weird stuff. And that seems to be our stock and trade. Robert Johnson, as a seminal blues musician, born May 8th, 1911, died August 16th, 1938. He wasn't afraid to deal in dark themes either. A lot of the early blues musicians, they weren't afraid to deal in these dark themes.
Well, and he was one of the first to be in the 27 Club.
That's exactly right. He might be the inaugurator of the 27 Club. Like he opened the juke joint.
Nice.
Of that Jim Morrison is singing in right now. So if you guys aren't familiar with Robert Johnson's music, you might be familiar with some of the versions you've heard on classic rock radio over the course of the last few decades. Probably the most famous cover of his music is going to be Cream's version of Crossroad Blues that they call just Crossroads. And that one hit. That was in the American Top 40. So, Clapton had already been playing that for a while, and then they just brought it out at a recording session, and it became, besides White Room, probably Cream's most famous song, is the Robert Johnson version of Crossroads. You might have, Led Zeppelin definitely aped Robert Johnson. We'll be talking a little bit more about that. But if you've heard their version of Traveling Riverside Blues, that's directly from Robert Johnson. If you've heard the Lemon Song, you've heard Robert Johnson. And they were, Jimmy Page was so inspired by his licks. Interestingly enough, Eric Clapton's the original guitar player in the Yardbirds. And then when they make the new Yardbirds or whatever, Eric Clapton leaves, goes to Cream. Jimmy Page is his replacement.
Oh, wow.
So this, Robert Johnson becomes super influential in the 1960s. Even though he's 27 years old when he passes away, he's only got 2 recording sessions in his life. And they recorded all of them like over a course of 3 days. And so one session was 3 days, the other session was 2 days, done in like a hotel room, improvised recording studio. And he had recorded 39 songs in a matter of those few days. And most of his recordings were released posthumously in that, while he was alive, people knew about him if you were a musician in the southern United States. But as far as he would not become the legend, he would become
celebrity. He wasn't like a celebrity.
Right, the celebrity, right? Because you guys just watched a movie on Netflix about him last night, right?
Yeah, it came out, I think, just a couple of weeks ago, remastered, Devil at the Crossroads.
And so, there's documentaries made about him. People write books about Robert Johnson. And then we'll get to, the most famous movie inspired by Robert Johnson in a couple of minutes. But, so he does this recording, and then they start getting, these albums and these songs start getting released slowly. And then when the British invasion, these British musicians in the 1960s started really getting obsessed with American blues music and the legend of the American bluesman. And that's how he takes off into public consciousness after you have those singles of Crossroads. Rolling Stones cover Love in Vain. Led Zeppelin apes half of his material. Which I did not, as someone who listened to so much Led Zeppelin as a young man, I did not realize how much they had taken from the original blues guys.
Yeah, no, it's really amazing. It makes me think you should maybe get a Robert Johnson reference in Saturday Night Gospel now somehow. Your song about listening to Zeppelin. But yeah, in that documentary as well, you're talking about all the people that were influenced by him. You know how tough it can be to track down A-list talent to appear in a documentary. But they had Keith Richards in there, Bonnie Raitt was in it, Eric Clapton. And the first concert I ever went to was an Eric Clapton concert when he began putting out blues albums, much more recently.
Sure.
And compared to, Yardbirds and Cream more recently. And he didn't do any of his classic stuff. It was all stuff off of his new album except for one classic Clapton song, and it was Crossroads.
Nice.
So
that's
again,
cool.
it's that's one thing one influence that he always pays homage to. And again, you hear classic Muddy Waters, And it's hard to not think of Robert Johnson because that influence is so strong. And of course, Muddy Waters was the guy that became the international superstar. And the Stones named themselves after one of his songs and
Right.
or a lyric of his. So that they talk about that. They address that in the documentary too. Keith actually talks about that a lot. Keith Richards talks about how, yes, we didn't know Robert Johnson, but we were absolutely influenced him through Muddy Waters and through these other bluesmen that came up just a little bit after him.
Well, we've covered a Robert Johnson song in the podcast before because his song, Sweet Home Chicago,
Right.
we talk about Eric Clapton. So one of the concerts that I didn't go to, but I would hear about all the time in my youth was the last performance by Stevie Ray Vaughan was at Alpine Valley Music Theater in East Troy, Wisconsin, which is about 10 minutes from my parents' house. And it was Robert Cray, Eric Clapton, Stevie Ray Vaughan. I think Stevie Ray's brother Jimmy was there. I can't remember if he was there with Double Trouble or with Fabulous Thunderbirds. But, there was this big jam at the end. Everybody came out. Stevie Ray, Robert Cray, Eric Clapton, they all jammed out. And the song they jammed out to was Sweet Home Chicago.
Nice.
So that was, they all sing it. And if you guys have heard it, and they sing it in the Blues Brothers. Baby, don't you want to go? You'd recognize it right away if you guys haven't heard it. But
and
that
we have a parody song of it.
Right, called Sweet Home Chicago Mothman. That's in our episode about the Chicago Mothman. But, so that's the last song Stevie Ray Vaughan ever plays is a Robert Johnson track.
Wow.
And so immediately after he's done playing it, he gets on the instead of taking the bus or whatever, he gets on the helicopter because he wants to get back to the airport and he wants to get back to Austin as soon as he can. And then what happens is that the helicopter crashes at Alpine Valley and then he passes away. So Robert Johnson, because we know so little about his life, he becomes steeped in folklore. And all you have are these recordings from the 1930s. And there's only 2 pictures ever taken of him.
Mm-hmm.
And, one of the pictures is the one they usually use. He's like sitting with his guitar. He's got like a derby on. He looks like a young man, like, I'm ready to perform for you, everybody. Come on.
Pinstripe suit. Very classy.
It's time for some blues.
I think it is those 2 photos, though, that helps him be this enduring legend, because the other one is way more casual. It's a closer-up shot. He's got a cigarette just hanging out of his mouth, and it looks like James Dean in a way. It's got that like classic cool look.
Yeah. The rebel.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that really is true. Like, I think those 2 pictures are like the 2 sides of him. Like, here's the polished side, and then here's the dark side, maybe, just looking at you, the dangerous aspect of him. And when you think about the life of these blues guys in the 1920s and the 1930s, they did live. When you think about the rock star life of like traveling from town to town and groupies and drinking too much and drug use and partying and everything, well, the Delta bluesmen in Mississippi in the 1930s, they set that mold for them. And we joke about how they influenced the rock stars of the 1960s and 70s musically. Well, they certainly did it with their lifestyles as well.
Oh, gosh, yeah.
Robert Johnson is, people remember him as a shy and, somewhat reserved kind of guy when he wasn't on stage. But also, when you think about it, so he's born in 1911. He's, 17, 18, and 19. Like, this is when he's first going out and playing with other people and going on the road. He comes from a huge family. His mom had 10 kids before he was born.
Wow.
and then she gets married to someone who's not his natural father.
Right.
And then so he eventually takes on his natural father's name of Johnson. And he gets married too when he's 18 years old. He gets married to a 16-year-old woman who dies in childbirth.
While he's on the road.
Yes.
So he comes home and the funeral's already happened. They've already been buried.
He comes home so excited because he's about to see his wife he hasn't seen in a while and meet his newborn child, and he has no idea that she died, and of course the child too. And so then, of course, as the documentary reports it, the family blames him for her death because he plays the devil music. So they're like, it's your fault that she died. So he comes home to this shocking scene. It's just so tragic to even imagine what that would be like, Like to get that news and then have everybody blaming you for it. Just horrible.
Well, the thing is, too, is that when you say the devil's music, it's not that specifically, like we think of the devil's music now. We think of the Satanic Panic of the 80s when you look at the artwork for Shout at the Devil by Motley Crue. Mm-hmm. And then they're all like, they're at a satanic mass, and they have, and there's upside down crosses and pentagrams everywhere.
And metal songs like, the number of the beast and stuff like that.
Right.
And then you see their Netflix movie and you're like, oh yeah, these guys are just frauds.
Right.
They're just Sunset Boulevard trash.
But they were using, occult imagery in their songs. But the thing is, Robert Johnson hardly even had any occult imagery in his songs. People thought of the devil music back then as anything non-religious.
Right. And I thought, again, referencing this documentary, I thought it was really interesting because they said the reason it started getting that reputation was because people were going out to the clubs and spending their money to hear this music.
At the juke joints.
And so the church leaders...
There's no money to donate then. The next,
They go to church and they wouldn't have the money to put in the hat.
So it was just a business. It's all about the money, It's like, if we start saying that that's for the devil, you guys get drunk and you fight and that's the devil coming out. You're letting the devil in. So don't go to the juke joints. Just come to church and spend your money here.
Right, bring your money here instead of to the show.
I think just the idea of juke joints are really interesting to me because first of all, that's where we get the term rock and roll comes from those juke joints. So the idea of a juke joint is that, how like we think of most places now, if it's a bar, it's a place that's set up, it's been designed to be a business, it's legal. They have their licenses in
most
order.
Most of them
are. Right. The bartenders had to take, a course or whatever. This is in the 1920s in the South. You got to remember that we're still dealing with an era of segregation. So you have these, black people who, after working a hard day, they want to go and party and do something. They can't go to the bars that are just for white people. They can't go to see live music with a white audience. They have to develop their own places. And the juke joints are just... it'd be lean-tos, just houses set up, abandoned buildings and everything. And it'd just be like, here's where we're having our party. We're having, this is where we're setting it up. And, this idea, they had sundown laws at the time too, where if you were African-American, you weren't, they had special curfews for African-Americans. That the sundown laws, that's, even in one of Robert Johnson's songs, he talks about, the sun's coming down. And in Hellhound on My Trail, he talks about how the sun's coming down and he's got to get home and got to keep moving on. And that's, people think that that's an actual allusion to the sundown laws against, people of color back in the, 1920s and 1930s. So they needed a place to go to. And where you're going to go to is the juke joint, set up just to be
a place to go.
A place for African Americans. And there's a circuit where they travel from town to town. And, when we talk about a traveling musician, these guys weren't staying in 4-star hotels. They weren't going on a tour bus. Robert Johnson would go from town to town. He'd start his day playing on street corners and in front of the barbershop for tips. And then in the evening, they could go play at the juke joint. And then there's stories of him. He tried to find the, as quote unquote, homely girl. That would let him come back and stay at their, at the house with their family. And so it was really a scrappy existence where you'd go play, make any money you could, and then beg to stay at somebody's house. It basically was house concerts.
Yeah.
In that idea. And then, the term rock and roll came from these juke joints, and also the idea of the term rock and roll, meant to make love, and that was their original usage. So when people were singing about rocking and rolling at the time in these juke joints, they were talking about getting it on. And so then, it becomes part of this of blues and R&B and black music and culture. And so eventually, when the white guys started taking the black, like think about Bill Haley, he comes on with Rock Around the Clock, Good Rockin' Tonight, things like that. Bill Haley's talking about making the beast with two backs. And so the DJs didn't realize what it was about. So DJs were just like, okay, we're just going to call it rock and roll music because they used it. I mean, Alan Freed, right, was the first guy to use the term rock and roll. And he's taking it because all the white guys who are doing these black songs and appropriating the terms from it, they're like, well, they use the word rock and roll so much, I guess we have to just call it that. And then
So you mean Kiss really wanted to do something else all night and party every day?
Yeah. Strange that Gene Simmons would even be thinking about something like that.
He seems like such a good boy.
Such a wholesome young man.
Right? Chaim Witz is one to think about, like, oh, such a good, you can imagine him, his bar mitzvah or whatever,
exactly.
and then you would think that he would eventually become like the demon in Kiss and like sticking out his tongue and just being disgusting, which he does so well. But, the language from that, though, we can get more into that in language in a second. We want to talk a little bit more about how Robert Johnson, and the legend behind him goes is that he's like 18, 19 years old, and people thought of him as a pretty good blues musician, not particularly on guitar.
Not among musicians as well. He did not have the respect of his peers.
Oh, yeah.
Right. They thought he was a decent harp player or whatever, harmonica.
Uh-huh.
And then he disappears for a while. And when he comes back to his home area in Clarksdale, he's a badass. Like, he's a great player. And so much so that when Keith Richards is listening to the recordings for the first time, Keith Richards thinks there's two guitar players and not one. Because Robert Johnson is doing fingerstyle where he's playing the bass line in blues music, the dun 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 dun, with on the bottom string, while he's doing the higher part, the on the top
With the slide or whatever.
Yeah.
And he also he added another string to the guitar too. Like he would string, I don't know, he must have doubled one up on one of the pegs
Yeah, I
or
was
something.
wondering about that, a 7-string guitar.
Yeah.
We still don't have that.
Well, we do, but their guitar is manufactured with a place for the 7-string, but he would just add the string to the, the 6-string normal guitar and somehow use that as another
more depth
sound. Right, exactly.
And so he was making this, fantastic sound. And like Keith Richards is like, oh, there must be two guitar players. And he gets amazed when he finds out there's only one guitar player. And so today we have this idea that when Robert Johnson disappeared for a little while, he went to the Crossroads, made a deal with the devil to become an awesome guitar player. And then that's how he changed so quickly.
They said that he vanished from the scene for about a year and a half. And nobody had any idea where he went. So it was just kind of like a mysterious, he's gone. And then when he came back, it was like a new person. The way he could play, it was completely changed.
And so that mystery then, that legend of him, going to that crossroads near Dockery Plantation at midnight. And there he's met by a huge African-American man, takes his guitar and he tunes it. And then he plays a few songs, returns the guitar to Robert Johnson, and when he gets it back, he's a master of the guitar.
Yeah, he says, if you take this guitar from my hands, your soul is mine.
And that's it. I mean, that gets into the legend. And the funny thing is that, there's another artist in the 1930s by the name of Tommy Johnson. And he specifically tells people that he made a deal with the devil to be so good at his music. Like that's part of, so Tommy Johnson is a contemporary of Robert Johnson. Actually, he's a little older because he's born in 1896. And he's also a Delta bluesman. He's playing the same juke joints, going around the South, playing the same street corners in front of barbershops. And he makes that part of his actual, his self-legend, his promotion. He's the premier Delta blues vocalist. And he's like, you know why I can sing so sweet? Because I sold my soul to the devil.
Oh, marketing. So it's always the good marketing. Yeah,
right.
So the thing is, and now, people remember Tommy Johnson, and he's a character in Oh Brother, Where Art Thou as well. And he talks about how he sold a soul to the devil to play guitar. And he even he says that. And, he sings on in the movie. He accompanies them on Man of Constant Sorrow or whatever, which is the famous song from Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Which is, first of all, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou is already 19 years old.
No, stop it.
But so that's an interesting thing. So now we have these two guys named Johnson, and their legends get confabulated.
Oh, okay.
So, because Robert Johnson disappears for a while, and Tommy Johnson, who actually courted the idea that he sold his soul to the devil for his musical talent, then that gets attributed to Robert Johnson. When in reality, Robert Johnson, I mean, first of all, did anybody actually sell their soul to the devil? Number one. Like, okay. Probably not. But second, Robert Johnson actually studying under a guy named Ike Zimmerman.
Could you imagine, though, if you actually did sell your soul to the devil and somebody else is taking credit for it?
That's a big one. That's a big one to Bogart.
Tommy Johnson, however, he did live until 1960 at least. So he had a full, we'd say 64 by our standards. Today, you're like, well, he's gone too early. But by the standards of the early 20th century, he still had a full life compared to Robert Johnson, who died
at 27.
At 27. And so one of Zimmerman's daughters talks about how Robert fit in the family. And she's like, he had to be nice because my daddy was a strong man and a good man. And he wouldn't have taken up no time with someone who wasn't a good person. He was just like a family member. He came and lived there in our house. And they met at the juke joints. And Robert Johnson asked my daddy how to teach him to play guitar. My daddy taught them. He lived there with my daddy. I'm quoting directly.
Yeah.
This girl
do the voice too. Yeah.
I'm not going to come out there and that's not. I'm just going to give a quote here. And she said that they were going at the guitar, and she remembers hearing the music, and it sounded so good, like they were competing. And that's what she said. He was really teaching him at an advanced pace, and he lived with their family for a year, and they practiced together on the tombstones in Beauregard Cemetery. So there we have that idea that Robert Johnson is playing in cemeteries at midnight.
It's not really the standard practicing place.
No, but it also is a place where you could be quiet and not disturbed. And since they were black, they couldn't hang out at other places. And you couldn't hang out like in the streets or whatever at night because of the sundown law.
Right.
Yeah.
So they practice in the place they're not going to be bothered. And they wouldn't bother anybody else in the house. And so they go to the graveyard.
One of the quotes from the documentary was that Zimmerman said, you can play as bad as you want here. No one's going to complain to you.
Right. It's that perfect place to woodshed, work on your skills.
But I just absolutely love that the debunking the myth of the devil at the Crossroads still involves going to a cemetery and playing, as they talk about at midnight, late at night, being influenced by the deceased spirits around you.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy.
It's still nice and cryptic.
Yeah.
Well, and, I remember seeing the movie Crossroads. I was a 9 when it came out, the movie Crossroads, and I think we saw it like an advanced preview. My mom had free tickets or something. And so we go see that movie. I had no idea who Robert Johnson
You were
is.
talking about Britney Spears and Brittany Murphy, that Crossroads.
Right, exactly. That classic movie. Britney Spears' star vehicle.
I believe the devil was at work in that one, though.
Right. The devil wrote the script for that one because he wanted to tank Britney Spears' acting career. No, but so there's a movie made in 1985 called Crossroads. It's directed by Walter Hill, Walter Hill's directed some great movies. He directed The Warriors. He's a producer on Alien. He's mostly known for action movies like 48 Hours. He directed Red Heat, which, come on, Arnold Schwarzenegger and Jim Belushi. Really, it's a really good movie. I'm playing a Soviet agent with Jim Belushi. It's a blockbuster. But so Walter Hill directs Crossroads, and it's got the Karate Kid himself.
Yes.
Nice.
Ralph Macchio, fascinated with the blues. He's fascinated with Robert Johnson. And so this is the first time I probably ever heard the name Robert Johnson, was when we saw the movie. Now, did you guys see the movie back in the 80s, or did you see it like later on?
I still haven't seen it. I don't know.
Yeah, I think I saw it later on.
All right.
Which surprises me because I really liked Ralph Macchio.
Right. He's good looking. He's on the cover of Teen
Right.
Beat. Tiger Beat. Tiger Beat. Right. He's part of the good looking young. Well, who else is in the movie? The girlfriend in the movie is Jamie Gertz.
Chicagoan.
Star from Chicagoan. Star from Lost Boys. Like just all around 1980s hottie. And so, like, she's in there, and it's this whole idea that he's searching, that there's a lost song of Robert Johnson, and Ralph Macchio wants to go find it. And then he finds a guy that was supposedly an associate of Robert Johnson named Willie Brown. Willie Brown, that name is in the song Crossroads, because there was a Willie Brown who was a contemporary blues musician and was friends with Robert Johnson in real life. And that's why in Crossroads, he's like, stand at the crossroads, tell my friend Willie Brown that he's stuck there, because the whole song is actually about not being able to hitch a ride. Stuck at the crossroads, can't get a ride. And so he's looking for Willie Brown, and then finds him, and you find out that actually Willie was the one that sold his soul to the devil so he could play harmonica. And then they go back to the crossroads. They meet the devil, and the devil says, you're gonna have to give me your soul or whatever. And then Ralph Macchio bravely says, like, you know what? If I'm gonna take you on in a guitar competition, and I'm gonna win, and then you're gonna give back Willie's soul. And the devil's like, sure, but if you lose, I get both your souls.
High stakes.
Yeah, double or nothing.
Right? And then they have a guitar off. And the guy that plays the guitar for the devil's guitar player, is Steve Vai.
Oh my gosh.
And it's funny you said that about Seven Strings, Scott, because I know it's been a long time. It's been 30 years since I've seen this movie, or 33 years, whatever, since this movie. But Steve Vai, he's famous he was really the first guy to play the 7-string guitar. So he himself designed his own 7-string guitar with Ibanez and things like that. And so his album Passion and Warfare features the 7-string that comes out 5 years after Crossroads comes out. And so Steve Vai is playing a 7-string guitar. I don't know if he plays it in the movie.
That would be a sweet little Easter egg.
Yeah.
If so.
Right. That he plays a 7-string like Robert Johnson. But also Eugene, oh God, the character, at first of all, they named the character that Ralph Macchio plays Eugene because they want to make him as white as possible before they blues him up, with Willie. He defeats the devil by playing a Paganini arrangement on his guitar because he's already studying classical music. And so that's interesting because Paganini also has a relationship with the devil.
Yeah, and there's quite a few similarities between him and the Robert Johnson legend because, they say that the rehearsing in the cemeteries was also a European
I didn't know that.
folklore legend and so I don't know if Paganini actually did or if it was just part of the rumor, but Paganini was such a phenomenal violin player that people just, they didn't believe he could be a human because he developed these techniques that were well beyond what the average player of the day had. And so, but the similarities, actually, some of the rumors say that his mother was the one that made the deal with the devil because she was really obsessed with him apparently becoming a good, right. Because he was a prodigy, no doubt about it. But people thought that she had made the deal with the devil that Paganini would get the talents and she traded her soul or whatever. But what I think is really fascinating is that the rumors started circulating about him having made the deal with the devil, and people reported seeing doppelgangers of him that had the cloven hoofs and horns and things like that walking around town. And also people said that they saw his bow get struck by lightning while he was playing. So just all these, you can see how it spins out of control. People start talking about him, and he had a really unique physical appearance too that kind of contributed to that because he had really long fingers and he just was kind of tall and lanky. But kind of interesting that his life also had similarities to Robert Johnson in that, once he got that reputation, it seems like he kind of took a turn down a road not so healthy.
Yeah.
With drinking and womanizing. And one of the creepiest rumors is that people said that he was a murderer and that he murdered one of the women that he was with and used her intestine to make a string that when he played the instrument, you could hear her shrieking.
Awesome. I want that string. Wendy, you need to get that string on your violin for live shows. But the thing is, we have to tell that story. We have to tell the story about the intestine and the string at some show coming up soon. And then play something totally happy. And then you just break out a shriek in the middle. And see, that's her.
But what he did with the violin was a lot, there's a lot of parallels to what Robert Johnson did with the guitar because he developed these techniques and he worked on things that other violinists of the time weren't, it wasn't even an option in their world. So they're focusing on intonation and bow control, and he's experimenting with all these different techniques and sounds that people had never heard come from the violin. So, he was responsible for, much like Johnson was responsible for a sort of a new genre almost. They gave him credit for the violin becoming more of a solo instrument and less of just playing in an ensemble or orchestra. So that's amazing to me.
I want to.
That is cool.
Jumping off of your the screams of the violin, I want to read this quote that I wrote to you last night. This is a music critic of Paganini, one of his performances. First off, the critic referred to him as Zamel, who is a mythical demonic huntsman, and said of the performance, the poor violin was a transformed victim in the demon's hand, uttering the anguished complaints of his inflicted torture.
Ooh.
So there's no way you guys could have the worst review of all time, no matter how bad any concert goes.
Paganini takes it. He takes the cake.
Yeah.
He gets the award.
Well, that makes me feel much better about the review that said a couple of fat middle-aged guys on stage.
Wasn't it like
They came out with
gel-haired...
yeah, like 90s gel-haired rock or something like that. That was... Well, that was... I mean... Right, that was like like 15 years ago or whatever, and these people had a particular axe to grind.
Clearly.
But
we're over it.
So, yeah, absolutely over. It's not like we remember it and talk about it every practice.
I want to jump in really quickly
bastard.
before we move on, because even at this point in time, and we were talking, 16 or 1700s when...
it was late 17... It was like 1782 he was born.
Okay, so... Already, the violin for centuries was associated with the devil at this point. Because I was thinking that maybe that was the first time that people were making that connection that the devil plays violin. But it actually starts back towards the 1400s.
Whoa.
And of course, why does any mythical superstition like this start? Usually a power grab or just straight up racism. And that's more so what it was. And that's when stringed instruments began to show up in Europe, but they came from Arabia in the 15th century. And that was a very un-Christian place, and it was maybe more sensual and not as
seductive,
refined. Yeah, so
dark.
So they...
I mean, they spent centuries fighting the Arabs in the Crusades.
Sure.
So this idea that the Arabians were aligned with the devil, that comes right out of the Crusades, because obviously the Muslims had taken over the Holy Land, and they were engaged in slaughter for centuries.
Yeah. So the first instruments were the rubab and rabak, who were kind of the forefathers to eventually, in the mid 1500s, the violin coming around. And so that association with stringed instruments like that, which is really fun to see, that now it goes all the way into now guitars, people plucking away on those stringed instruments still.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that the violin got that reputation. It was like one of the first devil's instruments. Also, what we learned was that part of it was because it was the first instrument that played, fun, dancey kind of music that was loud enough.
Right.
It was loud enough and it was portable. So people could bring it to local watering holes and play music. And then, of course, they're in that bad place and they're causing trouble.
And people are shaking their booties now.
Yeah, but I never really thought about the fact, there was an amplification. So what are you going to do? Bring like a bugle or something and start that's not fun.
Well, right. Well, I mean, that's... That we're talking about the juke joints, we're talking about the street corners, and it's this idea that the devil's music is the party music, the fun music.
But
it's true, and they say it's the devil's music because it's not holy, it's not religious, and the people who are playing it are guys like Robert Johnson, who have a different girl in every town. I mean, Robert Johnson or it could be Mick Jagger as well. We're talking about. Yeah. They got a different girl in every town. They're drinkers. Robert Johnson had a weakness for whiskey. We hear about. And, when he eventually dies, first of all, they're like, well, we're not exactly sure how Robert Johnson, died. But the idea is that, well, he died of syphilis, and which is, a sexually transmitted disease. And so even have that idea that he gets a crazy, he gets a disease from his
sinning,
devilish lifestyle. So these guys have this, very non-religious kind of lifestyle. So this idea that they're already in league with the devil because they're, doing evil stuff, isn't that far out of whack. And so we get to this idea of like, well, why would the devil live at the Crossroads? And, why would be this place where Robert Johnson would meet him? We got to go back to the 19th century, and it's still in the slave days. And then you have the slave owners and the plantation owners. They were trying to Christianize their slaves. So they kidnapped people. I mean, it wasn't just the whites and the Europeans we were doing this. There was Arab slave traders. There was African slave traders. It was a whole messed up culture of owning other human beings at the time. But once they were brought to the New World, the owners in their Christian mission wanted to convert their slaves to Christianity. They wouldn't let them practice their traditional religion. And so one of these former slaves, his name is Samuel Ajayi Crowther, and he's captured when he's 12 years old. He's taken over to Sierra Leone, and then when he gets there, he becomes like a ward of the church, and he eventually converts to Christianity. He's taught English, he's baptized, and then he becomes a missionary. And he decides it's his idea to help Christianize, all of the Africans in Nigeria and different places around Africa. And so he actually translates the Bible, the Christian Bible, into this language of Yoruba, the Yoruba people. And as he does that, he's looking for words for the devil and, different Christian characters like they would be in the African religion, so it makes sense. And so then he, in the translation, he makes the devil this character, Legba, who's this trickster spirit in these West African religions. And so he does that, and it goes by a whole bunch of different names, Eshu, Iku. There's a whole bunch of different names for this spirit throughout Africa, but they're all pretty much the same. He's the trickster, and he can also grant special powers. And he lives at the Crossroads. That's where you can go to try and summon Papa Legba. And so then we have this, in the oral tradition of the Africans, you have this character, this spirit, who then can grant powers, and people will, perform rituals to him and everything. He exists in voodoo, in Haitian voodoo, in New Orleans voodoo. And so, he's this character, you might see him, he wears a big hat. He often has a cigar in his mouth or a pipe. And, people will do rituals to him to get special, specific powers. So then you confabulate another thing here with this idea that, well, if you're going to make a deal with the devil, who in the West African language, in this translation, becomes the trickster spirit, you find him at the Crossroads. And so that's where you can make that deal. And so it's interesting that you take a little bit of the European legend of Faust, he sells the devil his soul in order for great power and wisdom, and goes with the African idea of performing a ritual to get powers and assistance from this Papa Legba, this Iku, this trickster spirit. And then you take a guy like Robert Johnson, who's playing the devil's music, and his songs like Hellhound on My Trail and the Crossroads Blues, things like that. And then it eventually becomes the legend that he sold his soul to the devil to be an awesome guitar player. And it's a really interesting history of how cultures kind of just leapfrog onto each other in order to get the ideas that eventually manifest themselves into a 1980s movie, yeah. Which leads to my youthful obsession with King Kurt.
Well, as a musician, I have to say, I really feel bad for these guys because to get that good at an instrument is so much work, so much dedication, so much discipline. And people are like, oh yeah, I sold it. Like, that, if it were that easy, right, if only it were that easy. So these guys just, they deserve so much credit for all that they put into mastering the instrument. Not only mastering it, like pushing it beyond the boundaries of like what is known. It's just like, oh yeah, he went and made a deal with the devil, like, and then he just walked away.
That's the only answer.
Yeah, he just walked away with this power. It's like, the guy dedicated his life to to the instrument.
Right. He did, and he was. It's not like they were living richly. Like you expect a deal with the devil, you're going to get rich.
Right.
You're going to have a lot of money. I mean, he had to take homely women, like he had to beg them to take him back to the plantation house or whatever.
To have a place
so he
to
could
sleep.
stay there.
And also, I think that it was almost like the self-fulfilling prophecy, or I guess, I don't know if that's the correct way to say it, but a lot of these guys, once they were accused of having made that deal, it's like their life kind of spun out of control even worse. It seems like they became...
With Robert Johnson, so he had the tragedy where his wife and, would-be child pass away in childbirth. And then, he bounces back from that. And of course, the family, as you talked about, blamed him because he's playing the devil's music. And then later he goes and he finds another girl and he wants to marry her. And she's forbidden to marry him because he's a blues man playing the devil's music. And I think at that point he was fed up. He's like, you know what? Yeah, I am.
Yeah, he just
I'm
owned
the
it.
devil. Screw it. And he just starts leaning into it and just he goes down that path out of despair and depression, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And just like, you think I'm this?
Right.
Sure, I'll be that.
Yeah, I'm going to own it.
Yeah, exactly.
Whether it was conscious or not. And Paganini's life also was that way too. Like, it seemed like as the rumors and the legends and the fame increased, he slid down that slippery slope.
Oh, yeah.
With the womanizing and the drinking, and he got STDs and all kinds of fun stuff like that. So interesting similarities there.
Well, and speaking of, I mean, there is an idea that Robert Johnson probably did have congenital syphilis, and that might have been a contributing factor in his death. August 16th, 1938, near Greenwood, Mississippi. They say he died, and it wasn't until 30 years later when somebody who was researching his life found the death certificate. In fact, there was a guy who was putting together a blues show for Carnegie Hall. In 1941, they didn't even know that Robert Johnson was dead. And this guy came to get him for a show in Carnegie Hall and found out that he was dead. And so it wasn't reported publicly. They say that they found a dead black man found by the side of the road near a farm near Greenwood, Mississippi. And, there's different accounts of, why he specifically died. Some people think that he was murdered by a jealous husband of a woman he had flirted with. That's what they talk about that in the documentary, right?
Yeah, the owner. Not only is he messing around with someone's wife, but it's the venue owner of a juke joint, the 3-4 Club. Eventually, Johnson buys a bottle of whiskey, but it was clearly tampered with. But he's like, well, I'm not letting whiskey go to waste. And he enjoyed it anyway, and then was absolutely sick for the next 3 days, and passes away. Nobody ever does time for the crime because, it's just another poor black man dying in Mississippi, and it's not a priority to find justice for that kind of a thing. Yeah.
And also there's this idea that he was on the plantation and he died, and here's somebody talking about a note on the back of his death certificate that they don't find until the 1960s. And the state director of vital statistics writes this: I talked with the white man on whose place the Negro died, and I also talked with the Negro woman on the place. The plantation owner said that the Negro man, seemingly 26 years old, came from Tunica 2 or 3 weeks before he died to play banjo at a Negro dance given there on the plantation. He stayed in the house with some of the Negroes, saying he wanted to pick cotton. The white man did not have a doctor for this Negro as he had not worked for him, and he was buried in a homemade coffin furnished by the county. The plantation owner said it was his opinion that the man died of syphilis. So that's where the syphilis idea comes from instead of the poison. But interestingly enough, this is from a 2012 NPR podcast on Crossroads on Robert Johnson. They think that there is a different Robert Johnson who was also touring around playing banjo in the 1930s and died near this plantation. And so that there's another guy who's out there with the exact same name, but he played banjo instead of playing guitar. And so that's who they think the guy that died of syphilis might be.
Wow.
Interesting. And could that also explain the multiple grave sites for Robert Johnson?
Yeah.
Right. Because there's 3 different places where they have, Robert Johnson tombstones. One is near the Mount Zion Missionary Baptist Church near Morgan City, Mississippi. And they actually have a 1-ton cenotaph in the shape of an obelisk there, listing his song titles and everything. And Columbia Records bought that. in 1990. But then also near the Payne Chapel in Quito, Mississippi, an Atlanta rock group called the Tombstones decided to give a burial site for Robert Johnson. And one of his ex-girlfriends said that this is where he really was buried. And they put a tombstone up there. So that was like a publicity stunt by the Tombstones.
Yeah.
And
that's why we all know their name today.
Yeah, right.
And so then another guy in 2000 thought that this actual gravesite is under a pecan tree in the cemetery of the Little Zion Church. And then Sony Music ended up putting a tombstone there in the early 2000s. So there's 3 different places you can go visit Robert Johnson's reported remains. And one of them might be Robert Johnson. Another might be this other Robert Johnson.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, why people get fascinated with these characters is because we can make up stuff about them.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know?
Well, speaking of the tombstone and the death part of the story, getting back to Paganini, just one more thing was that when he died, he was really sick, and they came in to give him his final last rites, and he refused. He refused the last rites because he didn't think he was going to die, and so in denial. But then he did die, and so he died without having had last rites. So they refused to bury him in a Christian cemetery. So that just fueled more and more
my
rumors
gosh,
after he was gone.
Absolutely,
Yep,
right.
that confirms, he's the devil. So,
Yeah, what I
interesting.
think is interesting about these things too is that Robert Johnson influences these 1960s artists that we were talking about in the beginning, guys like Jimmy Page and the Rolling Stones. And Jimmy Page obviously went full in on the occult symbolism.
Right.
And we've talked about that before, how they all had their own symbols on Led Zeppelin 4. Like they put the symbols in the album like sigils, magical sigils. That Jimmy Page won't even, and he still won't tell, like he still sticks to the magic, like he won't tell you what it means and stuff. Also, Jimmy Page bought Boleskine House, the home of Aleister Crowley, and supposedly performed rituals there. Boleskine House, which is just, didn't it just burn again last month?
Oh, I didn't hear about that.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. Boleskine House is on the shores of Loch Ness, so it makes it even more mystical or whatever, because Aleister Crowley, that was one of the things that some researchers have said that the Loch Ness Monster is not actually a cryptozoological, not actually a real
Been a
creature.
manifestation, perhaps?
Yeah, a manifestation of
Cool.
the different occult rituals that were performed there by people like Crowley or Jimmy Page. And even Robert Plant from Led Zeppelin talks about like how there probably wouldn't be a Led Zeppelin without Robert Johnson. And so, they really did, like a lot of the music that we consider contemporary rock and roll and heavy metal and everything has got a direct relationship to the music that Robert Johnson gave us.
Yeah.
So August 16th, the 81st anniversary of Robert's death, but his musical legacy still lives with us, as well as these crazy legends that he sold his soul to the devil. And it's such an interesting thing, the way that these culture, like the way that the cultures kind of jump on each other. African culture, European culture, the South in specifically, voodoo, and they all get together. Hoodoo, right? They all get together in this gumbo to form this perfect storm of legends that makes it so fascinating to talk about a very influential player so long after his death. So once again, we want to thank Scott Marcus from whatyourghoststory.com for joining us on this conversation. Actually, Scott suggested the topic because you saw the anniversary of the death, and so thank you for suggesting that, Scott.
Thanks, Scott.
Yeah, it worked out really well. I always love, I don't know, I've never been down there. The Mississippi Delta is very high on my bucket list of places to visit, just as a music lover, but also for the creepy spiritual side, too.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, you can go to the actual Crossroads. They have it near Clarksdale. It's probably not he didn't sell his soul to the devil like that. That didn't happen. But you can go to the Crossroads. They set up. It's like 2 guitars. And it's an intersection near Clarksdale, Mississippi, near where Robert Johnson grew up and where he's from. So if on your rock and roll bucket list, you can make sure and check it out. Even though it probably wasn't Robert Johnson that sold his soul to the devil, he just sold his soul to practicing a lot.
Yeah.
Anyone can do it.
That's right. One of Robert Johnson's most famous songs is called Hellhound on My Trail. And looking for inspiration from this week's song, we realized that, bands like Led Zeppelin would take a blues line or a lick or a riff and then move on to make their own entire song about it. So since Robert Johnson's treasure trove of lyrics and music has been excessively exploited by the British rock bands of the 1960s and 70s, went into something a little different. I was reading a book called The Thicket by Joe Lansdale. He wrote the Hap and Leonard series and Bubba Hotep that Bruce Campbell played Elvis in. And I just finished that book last week. And it's a really cool book, but there's some lines in it that really stuck with me. And one of them was that God is an idea and the devil is us. And that sounded like the perfect song to use because that era of the book is from the early 1900s. And it's an uber religious character who's constantly feeling guilty about the bad things he has to do. And it seems like that's the era of the South that Robert Johnson grew up in. And felt like the perfect kind of thing that maybe the hellhound that was always on Robert Johnson's trail really was just his best friend. And so that's the inspiration behind this week's song, Man's Best Friend.
Look behind my shoulder. Well, I'm always on the run. I look back behind my shoulder. Is there some kind of phantom? But Lord, don't strike me down. I was just having fun. And no one keeping score for a broken promise. There ain't nobody keeping score. Just a little weakness. 'Cause God's a good idea, but the devil is us. Every night in every town, well, I get lost and I get found. You know, I tried so hard to shake this hellhound, but he's my best friend. And no one keeping score for a broken promise. There ain't nobody keeping score for just a little weakness. 'Cause God's a good idea, but the devil is us. Every night in every town, well, I get lost and I get found. You know, I tried so hard to shake this hellhound, but he's my best friend.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. You can find us online at OthersidePodcast.com. Until next time, see you on the other side.
Well, real quick, before we go leave to make deals with unsavory characters, Mike,
Yes.
we got to make sure we thank our Patreon supporters.
Absolutely. I'll make a deal with the devil right now to get you guys to join the See You on the Other Side
Oh, boy.
Patreon community. No, really. The Patreons, they allow us to keep doing what we're doing. The more Patreons we have, the more cool stuff we can do, the more songs and videos and podcasts we can create, and the better content we can produce for you guys. And our Patreons right now, we want to thank you guys so much for being part of our community and making See You on the Other Side podcast possible.
Thank you. And yes, the more Patreon members we have too, the more interesting discussions we can have because everybody brings a little something to the table.
Absolutely. And so speaking of, one of our Patreons, Dr. Ned, who we mention in every single episode because Ned is at the level of Patreon membership where he's an executive producer on the show and gets a mention in every episode. But the thing is that we played a show with Dr. Ned singing actually a few years back, and he sang a Robert Johnson song as covered by the Rolling Stones, Love in Vain. And so our Patreons can help inspire podcasts as well as sometimes we'll play a song with them on stage.
That's right. And Ned, thanks for coming to our show last weekend. Also, it was great to see you.
So everybody out there, if you're interested in joining the coolest paranormal podcast community on the web, check it out at othersidepodcast.com/donate. And if you're a Patreon member, we'll buy you a drink and we'll see you in Michigan this weekend.
Cheers.
Sorry, I'm sorry. I'm totally distracted. Mike's hand was very low in the foreground, out of focus. I thought there was some being walking around behind.
because you have the blurred background set on Skype.
I'm like, there's a little head that's slowly entering the frame.
Nice.
Yes. Like, wait. I was transfixed.
I saw you staring at the screen. Okay.